Well, the idea for the Witte Veer came about 3 years ago. I was watching a television program in England about a monument that was being erected to memorialise soldiers who had died in the First World War. And all the names of these soldiers from a particular town were being inscribed on the monument. But there was interviews with descendants of soldiers who had either been shot as conscientious objectors or who had been shell-shocked in the trenches and lost their minds and been shot because they couldn't fight any further. And there was a great deal of pain and sorrow about the fact that these young men, teenagers, a lot of them, that their sacrifice was not being memorialised in the same way as the other soldiers. And it struck a chord in me, and it made me think about the idea of the conscientious objector, and not just the sacrifice that they would make by doing that, but also how it would affect the family back home, when they're, particularly if a son went to war, was fighting, and then saw things that made them turn away from the fighting. So that was where it began, and I pursued the story out of that. But the narrative voice is one of, it begins just after the end of the war, with a young man, Tristan Sadler, who has come back from the war, has survived. But he is going from London to Norwich for a day to meet the sister of a young man with whom he fought, and who we learn in the opening pages was shot as a conscientious objector. And over the course of a day, their story and what happened to this other young man, Will, is gradually revealed. Well, the position of a conscientious objector was quite a curious one in both the lead up to and during the First World War, because before you went to war, you could declare your status as a conscientious objector, and that would be brought to a military tribunal board who would hear your case and decide upon it. Now, if you were granted the status of a conscientious objector, several things could happen. You could be sent to jail, you could be sent to work on farms, you could be sent to work for the war effort in some way. But you would have to do something, otherwise you would be jailed. Now, once you went to war, you could no longer declare that status. You had to fight. But there were some boys who, once over there with the horror that was taking place, or simply with, as in the case of Will in this book, where a series of events make him feel that what the army is doing is contrary to what he signed up for, where somebody would say, actually, I'm putting my guns down. I'm not doing this any further. Now, you couldn't be granted status at that point anymore. That was considered desertion, in which case you would be shot. Now, the English title of this book is The Absolutist, and that is one step beyond conscientiously objecting, because where some of those conscientious objectors would be working for the war effort in some way, an absolutist like Will in this book will refuse to do anything. He won't fight, he won't help those who are fighting, he won't do anything to further the war effort in any way, and they would be summarily shot. So this is a part of history which is not talked about very often. And often these boys were as heroic as anybody else. I mean, to be out there fighting and to put down your guns on a principle and to feel that, what you're doing is wrong, it takes an awful lot of courage. Well, what happened to their families after these boys were shot is again a story which has not been told, I think, before, and which is one of the reasons I wanted to write the book. Because it occurred to me that if you had a son or a brother who went to France, was fighting, and then put his guns down and was shot, how are you going to be treated in your own hometown? So a lot of this novel takes place in Norwich, where Will is from, and it explores the feelings of Marion, his sister. Now, Marion, at the end of the war, is helping soldiers who come back from the war traumatized. She wants to help them, but she also hates them because they shot her brother. So, she has this very ambiguous feeling towards these young men. And her father is the vicar. So he holds a position of authority and responsibility in the town. So how do people respond to him when they see him coming? So there are scenes in the book where Marion perhaps is sitting in a cafe. Somebody comes in, sits down, sees who's sitting beside them, and moves somewhere else. And, and Marion and her parents are grieving. They've lost somebody that they love. And this is how they're made feel. So when I said that, this began with hearing the descendants of soldiers expressing their pain about what had happened to their ancestors, that's how I brought that into the book, seeing, well, what would it be like for Will's sister? What would it be like for his parents? How would they be treated by their former friends? History has always interested me, and in all the books that I've written, I seem to move around from period to period. I've written about life on the high seas in the 18th century. I've written about the Russian Revolution. I've written about the Holocaust. I've written, a lot of different historical themed books. And I find that when I finish a book, I'm ready to just move on to something completely different. So the last novel I wrote was set in the Russian Revolution. And it sort of naturally led me towards the First World War, because there was elements of that which, of course, came in with Tsar Nicholas and the revolution itself. But I'd always been interested in the First World War, but what I didn't want to do was repeat what I had read in so many novels, just write a story about the trenches. I felt there was a broader story that hadn't been told, particularly about these conscientious objectors and their families. So it was that. So over the course of the book, there's only actually 2 sections which take place during the war. The rest of it really takes place after it, and the effect of the war and how it has a grip on not just the young men, but everybody from society at the time, and refuses to let go of them. It's difficult to know where my interest in history came from, because I didn't study it in university, but I've always enjoyed reading historically based novels, particularly those novels that are set in the past but have contemporary relevance as well. I mean, I loved William Golding's novels, Rites of Passage and Fire Down Below, and I love I, Claudius. Claudius the God are 2 of my favourite books. But they also explore contemporary themes, which I think is really important if you're going to write about the past. I just find it like a broad canvas, really, that you can put so much into. I like doing the research. I like discovering how people lived and what they ate and how they travelled and how they spoke. I particularly like the language, because I usually start a novel by reading a lot of novels which are written at the time that my book was set, in order to get into the language of the time and the sort of words that might have been forgotten over time, and turns of phrase, that just, I think, add authenticity to a novel. So it's that, I think, more than anything else. Well, when I finished writing De Witte, one thing that struck me was, and this was quite subconscious, was the amount of connections between this novel and The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas, because they both really take place with just 2 boys who become friends in a wartime setting, and that friendship leads to disaster and trauma. And it's a very different story, because one concerns 8-year-olds and one concerns 18-year-olds. So there are differences there. But there's themes of loyalty, of friendship that go through them both. The friendship between Bruno and Shmuel in Boy in the Striped Pyjamas is the overriding theme of the book to me. And the friendship and love between Tristan and Will in De Witte Veer is the dominant aspect of this novel. So it's there are connections to be made. I think there are even some scenes that you could contrast them against each other and see ways that I'm exploring friendship and loyalty. I think in each of the books I've written, those themes seem to appear over and over and over again. I don't really set out with that in mind, but it seems to be something that I'm interested in, and that I'm trying to find more ways of expressing. I think what I'm interested in is friendship and loyalty towards your friends. Actually, there's a common theme in the novels of a young man set against a more powerful person. In my novel about the Bounty, it's a cabin boy with the captain. In The Winter Palace, it's a young soldier with the Tsar of Russia. But for both of those relationships, it's about loyalty. It's about a father figure. And in Striped Pyjamas and in De Witte Veer, it's not so much about power. It's more about remaining true to your friends, remaining loyal to them, even in the most desperate times. Because, of course, Bruno and Shmuel have to remain loyal to each other in the most terrible time during the Holocaust. And here, it's in the trenches. And the terrible experiences that these 2 young men are going through in the trenches, and how their friendship, how their relationship can develop and survive when they're both really going mad. Yes, the friendship between Tristan and Will in this novel develops into something stronger. Tristan and Will begin to develop a romantic relationship, which Tristan is very keen on, because Tristan himself, the narrator of the book, is gay. Will is a much more ambiguous character. I wanted him to be ambiguous in the sense that, this is 1916. This is not today, where young people are exposed to issues like this just in the general day-to-day culture. So Tristan has spent his life thinking about this. He's already dealing with this aspect of his own character. Will never has. And he's confronted with it for the first time. He's confronted with somebody who he's developing feelings for and who he begins a romantic relationship with, but which makes him feel very uncomfortable, and which, after any particular moment, he regrets and is almost violent towards Tristan in the aftermath of anything. But in the situation that they're in, with the war taking place around them, people dying around them, and them killing people, it almost feels to me at times that their relationship is heightened, and there's more passion and drama to it than perhaps there would be just in general day-to-day life, which is why this relationship becomes such a traumatic one for the two boys. I think one thing that I strived for in this novel was that when you're exploring a subject as large as the First World War, or in fact as large as the Holocaust, in the previous book, when it's such a big subject, for me it seems the best way to explore it is to pare it down, to minimalize it, to have as few characters as possible and just follow their journey. So in this novel, De Witte, Veer, there's really only the two boys and Will's sister. Only three characters, only two of whom fought in the war. But of course, the canvas on which they're fighting is enormous. But I feel it's if you try to tell everybody's story, you can tell nobody's story. It's easiest to tell one person's story and what they're going through. I felt the same way with The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas. With such an enormous subject to write about, if you tell it from the perspective of just two little boys, then you find a way in perhaps that someone hasn't done before. And that's what I was going for in this. Just one person's story, Tristan's story of what he went through, going to training for the war, fighting in the war, falling in love in the war, and then losing a friend, the person that he loves the most, losing him, seeing him shot as a conscientious objector. His story, follow his story, and then that tells the story of the war. I think by calling the First World War the Great War, it's a strange phrase. I think I always seem to call it the First World War because it doesn't. I think at the time it was people at the time called it the Great War because they hadn't seen anything of its like. But of course, what was it? 20 years later, the Second World War came along, which was even longer and more violent. So it's. I don't think it's ever been explored as much as the Second World War. You don't see it as much in novels or in film or in documentary. I think the Second World War, perhaps because there is more footage of the Second World War, because technology had improved by the 1940s than it had in 1915, 16. So you see more, I think, about the Second World War. But I've already written about the Second World War in a novel, so I wasn't going to write about that again. But it was interesting to go back to a previous war and see what parallels I could draw. And I think there are a lot of parallels between the two war novels I've written, particularly because they both center on two, well, in one book, two young boys, and in one book, two young men. But I think there's a lot of connections that can be drawn between the two. In researching the book, I began by going back to, in order to get the language correct, I start with the novels that were written at the time. So not novels about the war, just the novels that were written contemporaneously with the setting of the novel. Because if I do that, I get into the language of the book, I think, quite well. After that, I spent quite a bit of time at the Imperial War Museum in London, researching the First World War. I also read a lot of letters, as many letters as I could find, written by soldiers from the front, both from the training grounds at Aldershot and from the front, back to their families, and also the letters going back from their families to the soldiers. And one thing I was trying to learn was, I was trying to follow the journey of a voice, really, of how a young man's voice would change from the moment they arrived at training ground, through their journey to France, through the fighting, through the trenches, perhaps all the way up to the day before they're killed in the war, and how that would change. Because I knew, because this is a first-person narrator, it was crucial that that voice would differ as the novel developed, as he had more experience of war. And what I found was things that I found that soldiers would often, in the letters home at the start, and when they first arrived in France, they would talk a lot about the other soldiers around them. the people that they were fighting with. And they would be telling stories about people. And their families would be writing back and asking about these other soldiers. And as time would go on, they would stop writing about these people, and all the letters would become internalized, and it would all be about them, and it would become very, very self-centered, because they were going through such a difficult time and were trying to express their own emotions. And at that point, of course, the families might be asking, well, what happened to such and such who you were talking about? Now, those soldiers might have been dead by that point. So it was interesting to me that the more letters I read by soldiers, and particularly if I could read maybe 20 letters by one soldier, the difference in those letters were enormous. And it really, I think, helped me find the voice of Tristan and Will in the novel. Yeah, I mean, a lot of these letters are archived. A lot of them are published, but some are archived at the Imperial War Museum and other places, and in libraries as well. It's a case of, I've written a lot of historical books, and you learn how to use the archive material and what to use and what to discard. But the material is there, and there's so much in non-fiction about the First World War as well, where academics perhaps have also discovered letters and have published them in their own books. And it's just about tracking all those down and deciding what to use.